The laughter cut through the air like broken glass. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through Marcus's patience. He could feel it vibrating in his chest as he tightened the last bolt under the cruiser, the metallic click echoing in the hot afternoon air. Oil dripped from the undercarriage, smearing his hands, staining the knees of his coveralls. The smell of gasoline mixed with sweat and dust. Above him, the voices carried, the kind of laughter that came from men who thought the world was theirs to mock. "Guess the department's standards dropped," one officer said, his voice lazy and cruel. "Didn't know the garage sent comedians." Marcus didn't look up. He didn't have to. He knew that tone, the one that said you don't belong here, the one that always found him, no matter how many times he'd proven himself. He'd heard it in boardrooms, at gas stations, even in his own neighborhood when people didn't recognize the man behind the quiet. "Better be quick, boy," the taller cop added, his words heavy with entitlement as he spat near Marcus's boots. The glob hit the concrete with a wet slap, spreading like an insult that couldn't be cleaned off. Marcus's jaw tightened. His breath came slow, steady, controlled. He kept his head down, letting the silence build like pressure inside a sealed chamber. Every insult, every sneer, he collected them, filed them away, because that's what he did best: observe, remember, and wait. He twisted the wrench one last time, listening to the hum of the engine as it began to steady. The sound was clean now, smooth and sharp, like a truth that couldn't be denied. He stood slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, and turned toward the officers. The sun caught the sweat on his face, the grease on his fingers. One of the cops squinted, smirking again, as if Marcus's silence was proof of something small. "What, cat got your tongue?" he said, chuckling. Marcus met his eyes. For the first time, he let his expression change, just slightly, the faintest curve of his lips, not a smile, a warning. "All set, officer," he said quietly, his voice even and calm, too calm. The taller one stepped closer, standing a few feet away, his shadow crossing over Marcus's chest. "Yeah, let's hope you didn't mess it up, grease monkey." Marcus nodded once, pulled his rag from his pocket, and began to wipe his hands again, slow, deliberate, like a man preparing for something bigger than an engine tune-up. The rag slipped into his back pocket. Then, with a single motion, he pulled back his jacket. The sun caught the silver glint of the badge clipped to his belt. FBI. The laughter died instantly. The silence that followed was almost beautiful. It stretched wide and heavy, like a courtroom after a verdict. Marcus's eyes locked onto the lead officer. "Funny thing about standards," he said, voice low, calm, dangerous. "They tell you a lot about who you really are." The officer's mouth opened, then closed again. The color drained from his face. Behind him, his partner took a small step back, his smirk dissolving into confusion. The sound of the engine idling filled the air, soft and steady, like a metronome counting down the seconds of their embarrassment. Marcus reached into the cruiser, turned off the ignition, and handed the keys to the officer without breaking eye contact. "You might want to get that exhaust looked at," he said. "It's leaking judgment." He turned, walked toward his truck, and didn't look back. The sound of his boots against the pavement echoed through the garage, slow, heavy, final. But inside, Marcus's chest burned, not with pride, not even satisfaction. It was something else, something deeper, because he'd seen this pattern before, the arrogance, the laughter, the instant fear once the truth showed itself. It wasn't new. It wasn't shocking. It was the same script, just new faces. He sat in his truck for a moment, watching the reflection of the two officers in his rearview mirror. They stood frozen, still processing what had just happened. The taller one rubbed the back of his neck, muttering something Marcus couldn't hear. The other paced near the cruiser, glancing toward the exit as if hoping the moment would vanish into the heat. Marcus leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for just a second. His badge felt heavy at his waist, not because of what it meant, but because of how it changed people. a piece of metal that could turn laughter into silence, hate into fear. He started the engine and pulled out of the lot, the sunlight flickering through the windshield like a strobe of memory. As he drove, his mind replayed every second, the spit near his boot, the tone, the word boy. He'd been called that more times than he could count. But this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about what that word carried, the weight of a system that still measured worth by skin and uniform. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. The city stretched before him, hot and restless. He passed a group of kids playing basketball near the corner store. One of them waved, shouting something he couldn't quite hear. He slowed down for a moment, just watching. The laughter of those kids was different. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was free. Marcus smiled faintly. That's why he did what he did. Not for recognition, not for revenge, but for something bigger. To make sure those kids could grow up without swallowing the same kind of silence he'd learned to master. As the road opened up, his phone buzzed on the dashboard. A voice came through his earpiece, steady, official. "Agent Cole, you're needed back at headquarters. New case. Possible internal corruption within Metro PD." Marcus's eyes flicked back to the mirror. The image of those officers still lingered there, small now, fading into distance. "Copy that," he said, his voice steady. "On my way." He pressed the accelerator. The city blurred by. The cruiser he'd fixed was just another piece in a puzzle, one that stretched far beyond two laughing men in uniform. And somewhere inside him, the fire that had been quiet all this time began to burn a little brighter. Because Marcus knew something they didn't. Silence could be louder than shouting, and when the time was right, silence spoke justice. He drove on, the sound of the engine merging with the hum of the city, the beginning of something bigger than a laugh behind a badge. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the precinct, low and steady, like a nervous heartbeat echoing through the silence. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked. The same two officers who had laughed in the sun an hour earlier now sat rigid at a long wooden table, their uniforms pressed, but their pride wrinkled. The color had drained from their faces, replaced with something that looked a lot like fear or maybe shame. The laughter that had once spilled so easily from their mouths was gone now, replaced by the quiet weight of realization. At the front of the room stood Marcus Reed, Agent Marcus Reed, not the mechanic, not the man beneath the cruiser covered in oil and sweat, but a man in a crisp charcoal suit, badge glinting at his waist, posture steady as a mountain. His presence filled the room without a single word. Every eye was on him. Even the air seemed to hesitate. He looked around slowly, scanning the room. The department's seal hung on the wall behind him, polished but faded, a symbol of justice that didn't always live up to its name. He knew that. Everyone did. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, smooth, but every syllable carried power. "Thank you all for being here. This briefing concerns an internal corruption investigation, one that will involve every officer in this precinct." His eyes didn't blink. Every single one. A few officers shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The projector hummed to life as Marcus clicked through the first slide. Words flashed across the wall: integrity audit, Metro Division. The irony cut deep. And then his eyes landed on them. The two men who had laughed at him earlier. The taller one stared straight ahead, pretending to focus on the presentation. The younger one kept his head bowed, jaw tight, guilt painted across his face. Marcus paused, let the silence stretch. "You two," he said evenly, nodding in their direction, "we'll talk later." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was control. The kind of calm that made the walls close in. The kind that didn't need to shout to make its point. The rest of the room stayed silent as Marcus continued. He spoke about corruption, about accountability, about the cracks that form when arrogance goes unchecked. His tone never wavered, but beneath every word was something unspoken, something personal. He wasn't just talking about numbers or policy. He was talking about respect. about the way people saw him before they ever heard him speak, about how a man in grease-stained clothes could fix an engine, but somehow still couldn't fix the assumptions in people's minds. When the meeting ended, no one moved at first. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken. Finally, chairs scraped back, boots shuffled across the floor. The two officers tried to slip out quietly, but Marcus's voice stopped them at the door. "Gentlemen." They froze, slowly turned. Marcus stood at the head of the table, hands in his pockets, calm as ever. His gaze was steady, his tone polite. "You two have something to say." The shorter officer, Daniels, swallowed hard. "We didn't know, sir," he said quickly, eyes darting anywhere but Marcus. "We thought." Marcus took a step closer. "You thought what?" he asked softly. The softness made it worse, made it hit deeper. "That a man who looks like me couldn't hold a badge, couldn't stand where I'm standing now." The taller one cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that died halfway out. "No, sir, that's not what we meant." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Then what did you mean?" No one answered. The silence pressed in. You could hear the hum of the lights, the faint buzz of the city outside, the sound of pride cracking quietly in the corners of the room. Marcus nodded once. "You didn't mean anything, that's the problem." His eyes softened, but his words didn't, because meaning nothing doesn't make it right. It just makes it easier to pretend it never happened. The younger officer's face flushed. The older one looked away. Marcus let the silence hang for a beat longer before he turned back toward the projector, shutting it off. "Get back to work," he said simply. "We've got bigger things to fix." They left the room without another word. Later, the locker room was quiet except for the sound of metal doors clanging shut. The younger officer sat alone on the bench, staring at his hands. The smell of sweat and detergent filled the air. He rubbed at the grease under his fingernails that wasn't there anymore, but his mind was somewhere else. Back in that garage, in the heat, in the moment the truth hit him like a wave. His partner slammed his locker shut. "Forget him," he muttered, grabbing his cap. "He's just trying to make us look bad." The younger man didn't answer. His reflection stared back at him from the locker's dull metal. He didn't see Agent Reed's face, but he heard his voice. "You thought what?" He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "He wasn't trying to make us look bad." His partner stopped mid-step. "What?" "He didn't humiliate us," the younger man said, voice low, almost to himself. "He just showed us who we already were." The words sat heavy in the air. His partner scoffed but didn't respond. After a long moment he left, the door swinging shut behind him. The younger officer stayed seated, still staring at his reflection. His chest felt tight. It wasn't guilt that hurt, it was recognition, the kind that made you see yourself for the first time. He thought about how easy it had been to laugh earlier that day, how natural, how normal, a quick joke, a spit near someone's boot, and now it all felt wrong, ugly. He looked down on a man who had spent his life looking deeper, a man who'd stayed calm when others would have lashed out, a man who'd seen through the laughter and found the truth underneath. He sat there for a long time until the locker room was empty. The sound of the air vent filled the silence. He didn't move, didn't know how. Meanwhile, across the precinct, Marcus stood by the window of his office, watching the city lights flicker against the glass. The skyline stretched out before him, endless, glowing, restless. He took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and let out a long breath. The reflection in the glass stared back, a man who'd fought too long to earn the kind of respect others got for free. He wasn't angry anymore, not really, just tired. Tired of carrying the weight of assumptions, tired of proving what should have been obvious. But he also knew something those officers didn't. Sometimes, silence teaches louder than shouting. He turned off the light and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing softly against the tile. As he reached for the handle, a faint smile crossed his face, not of pride, but of purpose, because deep down, he knew what he'd done today wasn't about revenge. It was about reflection. And maybe, just maybe, that reflection would start to change something. In that silence, between guilt and understanding, between laughter and respect, the first cracks began to form. Small, quiet cracks that might one day let the light in. Because the truth was simple. The badge doesn't make the man makes the badge. And dignity, real dignity, can't be worn, it has to be lived. Days passed, but the memory lingered like a weight in the air that wouldn't lift. The laughter, the heat, the spit on the pavement, they replayed in Marcus's mind, not as anger, but as a lesson in how slow change really moved. He'd seen men like those officers all his life, men who wore badges but carried blindness. And he'd seen what that blindness could cost. So when his phone buzzed one morning with an unfamiliar number, he almost ignored it, until he saw the name, Officer Daniels. The message was short, hesitant. "Sir," it read, "I owe you an apology, not because you're FBI, because you didn't deserve that. No one does." Marcus sat back in his chair, the glow from the screen lighting his face in the quiet of his office. He read it again, then again. There was something raw about those words, the kind that didn't come from training or orders. They came from realization. He could almost hear the officer's voice trembling through the text, the kind of trembling that comes when shame meets honesty. He let the silence stretch before typing back, his fingers steady, his expression unreadable. "Then start by treating the next man you meet better." He hit send. No lecture, no anger, just a direction, one that said, what you do next matters more than what you did before. That weekend, the city sweltered under late summer heat. The air shimmered above the asphalt, and the sound of traffic hummed like a restless heartbeat. Officer Daniels was off duty, dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt, just another man stopping for gas on his way home. He moved through the small station in silence, nodding to the clerk, his mind somewhere else. He hadn't stopped thinking about that day, about the man in coveralls who'd looked him in the eye without hate. About how easily his laughter had turned to guilt. As he pumped gas, a car rolled to a stop at the far end of the lot. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. A black man in his 40s stepped out, wearing a work uniform, sweat already darkening the collar of his shirt. He popped the hood, fiddled with something, but the car wouldn't turn over. Daniels watched for a moment, that old reflex flickering, the one that made him judge before he understood. But something inside him caught that thought before it could speak. Marcus's words echoed in his head. "Then start by treating the next man you meet better." He hesitated, then set the pump back in its cradle, walked over, "Need a hand." The man looked up, wary at first, then nodded. "Yeah, I'd appreciate that. She just died on me out of nowhere." His voice carried exhaustion, but also humility. Daniels leaned over the engine, sleeves rolled up, scanning the lines and belts like someone who'd done this 100 times. He found a loose cable, tightened it, told the man to give it another try. The car sputtered, then roared to life. The man's smile was immediate, grateful. "Man, thank you, thought I was gonna be stuck here all day." Daniels smiled back. "No problem." It felt simple, but something about it hit deeper. No uniforms, no walls, just two men under the same sun, one helping the other. The man reached out to shake his hand. "Name, Clarence." "Daniels," he replied. "Good to meet you." As Clarence drove off, waving through the open window, Daniels stood there a moment longer. The heat pressed down, but he didn't mind it this time. It wasn't the kind of heat that burned. It was the kind that melted something old away. That night he sat on his porch, the city lights flickering in the distance. The laughter from that day felt distant now, like a voice he no longer recognized. He thought about how easy it was to dismiss a man you didn't understand, how quick the world was to judge on sight, and how hard it was to face the mirror afterward. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling back to Marcus's message. 6 words that had changed everything. Start by treating the next man better. He whispered them under his breath, almost like a prayer. Across town, Marcus sat alone in his office, the lamp casting a soft circle of light on his desk. Case files sat stacked neatly in front of him, but his mind wasn't on them. His gaze was fixed on a framed photograph, his father, in a worn denim shirt, leaning against an old truck with a wrench in his hand. A mechanic through and through. A man whose hands built things, fixed things, while the world often looked right past him. Marcus traced the edge of the frame with his thumb. "We rise," his father used to say, "by what we fix, not just in engines, but in people." Those words had stayed with him long after his father was gone. As a boy, Marcus never understood them. He thought they were just about hard work, about doing your best, no matter who was watching. But now, sitting there, he saw the truth his father had tried to pass down, that every act of patience, every moment of grace, every time you chose understanding over pride, you were fixing something larger than yourself. He leaned back in his chair, the city skyline glowing through the blinds. The world outside still buzzed with injustice, still laughed before it listened. But tonight, somewhere out there, one man had made a different choice, one small shift in the current. And sometimes, Marcus thought, that was how change began, not with noise, but with quiet correction. He thought about Daniels, about the apology, about the ripple that might come from one man learning to see. Maybe Daniels would tell someone else, maybe he wouldn't. But even if no one ever knew, that single act of help at a gas station meant something, because compassion wasn't meant to be seen, it was meant to be felt. Marcus stood, turning off the light. As the office fell into shadow, the photo of his father caught the faint glow from the street outside. "You were right," he murmured softly. "We fix people too." He walked toward the door, paused for a moment, and looked back once more. The badge on his desk gleamed in the dark, a symbol of power, but tonight it felt lighter. Not because the job had gotten easier, but because the purpose had become clearer. Outside, the night was still. The city hummed with its usual noise, sirens in the distance, laughter spilling from open windows, engines humming down long streets. Life moved on, messy and loud and unpredictable. But within that chaos, two men had changed direction, one by teaching, one by learning. And maybe that was enough. Because respect wasn't about titles or uniforms. It wasn't something you earned through fear or demanded through rank. It was something you built one human moment at a time. And as Marcus stepped out into the night, a faint smile touched his lips. He thought of his father, of Daniels, of all the faces he'd met along the way. The laughter that once mocked him now seemed smaller, distant, fading into memory. What remained was the truth, that the greatest lessons aren't the ones we speak, they're the ones we live. ChatGPT said. The conference room buzzed with low chatter before Marcus entered. Officers shuffled papers, avoided eye contact, and adjusted their uniforms as if the starch in their collars could stiffen their nerves. The announcement had gone out a week ago. Agent Marcus Reed will be leading the department's diversity session. Some thought it was a formality, a PR stunt to clean up the whispers that had spread since the garage incident. But for one man sitting in the second row, Officer Daniels, this wasn't publicity. This was penance. He was the one who had asked for it. He had seen the look in Marcus's eyes that day, the kind that didn't demand revenge, only reflection, and reflection had been haunting him ever since. When Marcus stepped through the door, the room fell silent. No sirens, no jokes, just the sound of his shoes on the polished tile. Gone were the oil-stained coveralls. He wore a crisp grey suit, simple but sharp, the kind that didn't need to boast. His badge glimmered faintly under the fluorescent light, but it wasn't the badge that held the room, it was the man wearing it. Calm, collected. The same mechanic they had laughed at, now standing before them as their teacher. He looked around slowly, eyes moving across familiar faces, faces that had once smirked, faces that now looked away. Didn't start with a slideshow or statistics, just a story. "A few weeks ago," he began, voice steady and low, "I was under one of your cruisers fixing what was broken. I remember hearing laughter. It wasn't the first time, and I doubt it'll be the last." He paused, letting the air stretch. But that day something changed. Not the car, not the system, just a few hearts maybe. His gaze landed on Daniels, who lowered his head. Marcus continued, his tone firm but never bitter. I didn't come here to shame anyone. I came here to remind you respect should never depend on a uniform or a skin tone. The words hung heavy. Some officers shifted in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, the weight of their own silence pressing down on them. Marcus walked slowly to the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "When I was a kid," he said, "my father worked on engines his whole life. He fixed cars for men who wouldn't even look him in the eye. Some would drop the keys without saying a word. Some would call him boy. But my father never raised his voice. He'd just fix the car, wipe his hands, and whisper, 'We rise by what we fix, not just in engines, but in people.'" He took a slow breath, his eyes glistening with memory. "He didn't live long enough to see me wear this badge, but if he did, he'd tell me the same thing he told me the day I left home: don't forget what it feels like to be looked down on. That's how you remember to lift others up." The room grew still. Even the air seemed to listen. Marcus turned toward the board behind him where someone had written "Building Trust" in thick blue marker. "Trust," he repeated softly. "You can't build it if you don't see people. If you look at someone and only see a stereotype, you've already failed your oath. The moment you stop seeing a man's worth because of his work or his color or the dirt on his hands, you stop serving justice." His tone deepened, not louder, but heavier, the way truth tends to fall when it's undeniable. He looked toward the back of the room where two officers whispered under their breath, and instead of calling them out, he smiled slightly. "You don't have to agree with me today," he said, "but you will remember this, because every one of you will meet someone on a call, on a sidewalk, maybe under a car, and you'll have a choice: laugh or listen, and that choice will say more about you than your badge ever could." The clock ticked softly. No one moved. Daniel's throat tightened as guilt washed over him again, heavier this time, but somehow cleaner. He thought about that day, about his own laughter, about the heat, about how he'd spat near the man who now stood before him. He told himself he was just joking, but jokes like that leave scars. He'd seen the scar in Marcus's silence, and now he felt it in his own heart. Marcus wrapped up his talk with no theatrics. "We all fix something for a living," he said. "Some fix cars, some fix cases, some fix communities, but all of us, every one of us, are responsible for what we break." He stepped back, eyes scanning the crowd. "I just hope when you leave this room, you'll start fixing the right things." For a long moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then, from the middle row, a sound broke through, slow, deliberate clapping. It was Daniel's. His palms met softly at first, as if testing permission. Then stronger, louder. The sound filled the room, and one by one, others joined. The echo of applause rose, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. They weren't just clapping for Marcus. They were clapping for what he'd reminded them to see. Marcus nodded once, humbly, and stepped away from the podium. As he reached the door, he paused for a brief glance out the window. Parked outside was the same cruiser, freshly washed, shining under the afternoon sun, the one he'd fixed weeks ago, the same one that had once been the scene of their mockery. He stared at it for a long second, a faint smile touching his lips. That cruiser had carried a lesson, not about engines, but about empathy. Outside, the air felt lighter, warmer. He loosened his tie, looked up at the sky, and exhaled. Behind him, the officers began talking quietly, but the tone had changed. There was no laughter this time, only thought. Daniels followed Marcus out a few minutes later. He didn't speak, just nodded respectfully as their eyes met. No apology needed. It was already spoken in his actions. Marcus walked toward his car, but before getting in, he glanced back at the precinct, the building that had once been a wall, now starting to look a little like a bridge. Maybe that's what change looks like, not loud, not fast, but steady, one small repair at a time. And as he drove off, the narrator's voice would linger in the hearts of viewers, because sometimes the real repair isn't mechanical, it's moral. The screen fades to black, the cruiser's reflection gleaming in the sunlight.